Greetings folks, and welcome to another 81632-bit. As ever, I'm your host Drob, and as you've undoubtedly seen from the thumbnail today, we are looking at the Sega Master System and why it failed. Or maybe didn't fail, depending on whereabouts exactly in the world you live, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, the Sega Master System was Sega's attempt to take on the might of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom. Now, originally released in Japan as the Sega Mark III, the system did see worldwide release in a redesigned form as the Master System. Now, the Master System was technically more powerful than the Famicom stroke NES, and it certainly could, on its best days, make Nintendo's machine look very primitive. Now, obviously, we all know that the NES stroke Famicom managed to dominate the 8-bit console market through the 80s and into the early 90s, and hopefully in this video we will explain somewhat why that happened. Now, first thing we need to do, as ever, is look at the technical specifications of Sega's machine to understand what we're working with here. So, without further ado, let's get into the listing. Now, the Sega Master System was based on the ubiquitous Zilog Z80A microprocessor as its CPU, which ran at approximately 3.58 MHz, depending on whether it was PAL or NTSC. The Master System came equipped with 8 KB of RAM and 16 KB of VRAM, and was capable, thanks to its Yamaha VDP, of displaying a resolution of 256 by 192 pixels with a massive 32 colours on screen at once. Audio was also produced by the Yamaha VDP through the use of PSG sound as an SN76489, and the Japanese model also had an add-on available which allowed it to use a Yamaha YM2413 to generate FM sound in some games. Now, the system was backwards compatible in Japan with the SG-1000, and in the West and in Japan indeed, it also utilised 2 software formats, which was something unique for most consoles. There was the standard plug-in cartridge, and there were also some credit card sized card games which used a much lower capacity. Now, the system itself was pretty solid, and you look at those specs, and compared to the NES, it had 4 times the amount of system memory, 8 times as much video memory, and a much higher clock rate. And if you have any idea about the 8-bit micros of the time, the difference between the 6502 that was utilised to base the Famicom and NES around and the Z80 was generally a faster processor anyway. Now, the machine went through a number of iterations and was released globally, and the Master System does hold a unique place in history. The Master System is considered to be the longest running video game console in history, because once it was released in Brazil in 1989, it has been, in essence, in production ever since, through a huge number of variations from Sega's Brazilian licensee Tectoy, but that's a whole different subject. Now, as I said, the machine was released in the mid-80s. It was released as the Mark III in October of 1985 in Japan. The redesigned Master System version hit the US market in September of 1986, Europe in the June of 1987, and was also re-released in Japan as the Master System in October of 1987. The Brazilian release, as I said, came in 1989. Now, in Japan and the US, the Master System had a reasonable run. It ran until 1991 in Japan and 1992 in the US. However, in Europe, the system was still being sold and games were still being released all the way up until 1996. And as I said, in Brazil, it still happens. Now, the games themselves, as I said, there were 2 formats for the games. They either came on a cartridge or a card. Now, the cartridges were up to 4 megabit in size, that's 512 kilobytes of code, and the cards could hold up to 32K or 256 kilobits of code. The cards did get denoted by their megabit size, so they were 1 mega, 2 mega, and 4 mega, and they were fun. The cards, given the massively smaller capacity, we used some much more limited games, but again, there were still a few little interesting bits and pieces released on it. Now, we all know that the NES absolutely crushed the Master System, unfortunately. Now, the Master System is estimated to have sold somewhere between 10 and 13 million units globally, plus an extra 8 million units in Brazil alone with its variations. Now, as I said, top of the video is called Why the Master System Failed, or didn't, depending on where you live. And that's very true. You see, in Japan and the US, despite having roughly sort of 5-6 year long lifespan, the system just was not successful. It was a distant third in Japan in the 8-bit war, with the Famicom and the PC Engine absolutely dominating it. And in the US, it was a very distant second to the NES, and we'll get on to why in a minute. However, in Europe, especially the UK and Brazil, the Master System was king. Seriously, it was just way more popular in both of those territories. Brazil certainly because Tectoy's incredible usage of Brazilian laws to make sure that they were pretty much the only game in town for a long time. And in Europe, it just resonated better with gamers for some reason. Now, when you look at it, the reason that the Master System failed in the majority of the world, and certainly what will be considered the world's 2 biggest markets, would really be down, I feel, to Nintendo's, shall we say, egregious licensing practices. Basically, if you wanted a license to produce games for the Famicom or the NES, you basically had to agree that you were only going to release those games on those platforms and on no others. Ultimately, this would really prove to be illegal, but nobody was willing to challenge Nintendo over it. So a lot of what would be considered the big hitters in the console space, from companies like Capcom, Konami, etc., ended up only on the Nintendo systems, which left Sega reliant on its own internal software teams developing arcade ports and original titles, and on a lot of European developers. Now, this was fine here in Europe. It meant we got some amazing software titles, but for the US and Japanese market, it meant that the games that the gamers wanted just weren't there. Which isn't to say the Master System didn't have some brilliant titles, as we'll get onto in a moment, but this difficult licensing deal that Nintendo had set up with their licensees certainly did ultimately cripple the Master System in 2 of its major markets, hence its poor sales. Now, in terms of the Master System software library, as I said, whilst you were missing most of the big hitters from your companies like Konami, Capcom, Square, you still had some amazing software coming out. Sega themselves released some absolutely incredible games during the Master System's lifespan. There were arcade conversions of their own titles such as Outrun, Fantasy Zone. You had games such as the Master System versions of the Sonic the Hedgehog titles, which were just as good but very different to their Mega Drive / Genesis counterparts. You had the first entry in the long-running Phantasy Star series hit the Master System, and is undoubtedly a high point for 8-bit console RPGs. You had games like the original Ys got a conversion to the Master System. You had European exclusives such as Road Rash, Asterix, and an absolutely outstanding version of Aladdin which landed in 1994, which frankly looks far better than anything on a system released originally in 1985, should look. You know, there was some great stuff out there, but you know, when you compare it to what the NES and the Famicom were getting with the Mega Mans, the Final Fantasies, you know, even licensed stuff like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which never hit the Master System, this was what held Sega's little console that could back, unfortunately. And it just, yeah, it's sad because the Master System is an incredibly powerful piece of kit. You can see the evolution of the software from the very early days with titles that were released early on all the way up to the end of the market. You know, there was a really good version of Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2 released for it. But ultimately, the Sega push just could not defeat Nintendo's marketing monolith at the time. It wasn't until the next generation with the Mega Drive and Genesis where Sega gained a real foothold in the console market globally, but even then the Japanese market eluded them. But that's a story for another time. Now, it is sad that the Master System failed but didn't, and from my perspective as a Brit, the Master System was never a failure. It was only really as I got older and started looking on the internet that I realised that my beloved Master System, which to me was a huge popular machine, just wasn't popular globally. You know, there were no Master System games released in the US after the original Sonic the Hedgehog, which is a shame because it meant US gamers missed out on some of the best that the system had to offer in that last sort of 2 to 3 years of its realistic commercial lifespan in Europe. But anyway, that's why the Master System failed, or didn't. You know, it was Nintendo. I'm sure that will upset people, but it's true. It's not like Sega didn't try. They had the games, they had the hardware, but Nintendo had the developers locked up. Now, if you've got comments about this, don't forget, leave them down below. If you've liked this video, do hit the like button. If you really enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button. Ring the bell to be notified when I update and upload new videos. You know, you'll see a bunch of options on the end screen here for how you can get in touch with me and how you can help the channel. And until next time, this is Rob saying so long and thanks for watching 81632-bit.